Let me start with the recording. Okay. So now, welcome to our first tutorial session for AUI 3701 in this 2024 academic year. My name is Mr. Privilege. I'm the tutor with Grad Consulting, and I'll be facilitating you colleagues with respect to the content for this module. Right. So before I get into the content for tonight's engagement, I would like to first start off by taking you through the outline of essential topics according to your study material, just so that at least you can have a reference point to what I'm going to be presenting in the notes for tonight. Right. So essentially, you have about 7 topics that we are going to be looking at for the duration of the semester. The first topic is what I'm going to begin with in tonight's engagement, where we'll be looking at concepts regarding to the International Professional Practices Framework, which is what they normally abbreviate as IPPF, requirements pertaining to the planning of an internal audit. So there's at least about 3 learning units that we'll be looking at, and I'm going to cover 2 of those in tonight's engagement, which is obviously learning unit 1 as well as learning unit number 2. So in learning unit 1, what you are introduced to is the concept regarding to the IIA Code of Ethics, whereas in learning unit 2, we'll be looking at the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing. And this can also be prescribed as the IPPF standards in other terms. So it simply refers to one in the same principle. Then, of course, learning unit 3 deals with other internal audit guidance impacting on the planning of an internal audit. I'm going to touch slightly on those, but we will not get into details pertaining to that in tonight's engagement. Right. So then obviously, you've got the rest of the other topics, such as aspects of the business environment, and that's where the concept of enterprise risk management becomes handy. So I've got notes where I explain about the principle concerning enterprise risk management. We'll also be looking at the concept on corporate governance. There's an aspect about corporate governance that you need to know there. And then obviously control risk self-assessment. It actually goes hand in hand with enterprise risk management. Right. So that's what you'll be looking at in topic number 2. Topic 3 deals with the nature of the audit engagement, the typical types of audit engagements which internal auditors are allowed to perform according to the IPPF framework. So obviously, you've got the 2 types of services that we offer as internal auditors, which is namely assurance services, and of course, there's also what we call consulting services. Right. That's where most of those will be explained in this particular topic number 3. So when they're talking about the types of internal audit engagements, they're referring to those 2 types or 2 classes of internal audit services that we offer. The very same principle was also introduced to you guys in AUI 2601, which is a second year internal audit module. So if you want to even gain more insight pertaining to learning to this particular topic number 3, precisely learning unit number 6, you may also need to look into some principles that are explained in AUI 2601. I'm going to provide the study material for that particular module so that at least you can have a reference point. Right. And of course, there's the engagement planning process. So when you're looking at the engagement planning process, you need to understand the typical planning engagement activities. In other words, what are those activities that we as internal auditors are expected to carry out during the planning phase of an internal audit engagement? All right. So there's quite a number of activities that we perform during that phase. One of them is determining the audit objective of the audit engagement in concern. One of them is also determining the engagement scope, the timeline of the engagement in concern, and so forth and so forth. So that's what we'll be looking at when we get to learning unit number 7 with respect to topic 3. Topic number 4, it introduces you, but not in a greater detail. It introduces you to the concepts of information technology. How does IT affects our profession as internal auditors? What are the benefits that information technology has with regards to our profession as internal auditors? So those are some of the aspects that you can expect, or rather that you are expected to note when it comes to this particular topic number 4. But we're going to get into that in a greater detail, right? Then topic number 5, they also test it, but mostly what I've picked with topic 5, preliminary survey. So preliminary survey, it can also be attributed to a methodology that internal auditors can use in order for them to collect audit evidence, right? So when it comes to this particular topic or concept, you can find it heavily tested a lot, especially in the assignments, the written assignments, to be more precise, right? But of course, I think there's one of the recent past papers I was looking at. I think it should be the October, November 2022. There was some aspect where they were testing you on preliminary survey. So I would not say let's leave a stone unturned with regards to it and just reserve it only for assignment purposes. But I would endeavor that we get into it in detail when we get to that part. Then, of course, there is topic number 6, which deals with documenting of business cycles and processes. Now, with business cycles, similar to what you will see in AUI 3702, right? Similar to what you would see in AUI 3702. And when you get to an honors level program, you would see the same thing in AUI 4863. Right. So what happens is with documenting of business cycles, there are certain principles which you get tested on with regards to this. One of the commonly tested principles pertaining to the business cycles would be for you to draft analytical audit procedures. I repeat again, they would expect you guys to draft analytical audit procedures. They would also expect, let me just write it down so that at least you can be able to pinpoint some details that are key when it comes to this topic. So obviously they would expect you guys to draft analytical audit procedures. That's number 1. Number 2, they would expect you guys to draft audit objectives. Okay, they can also ask you to draft typical audit procedures. Typical audit procedures, right? And when I'm talking about the typical audit procedures, there are 2 here that they can ask you to draft, which is namely your test of controls, as well as the substantive audit procedures. So substantive audit procedures in the sense where you are provided or presented with financial information that you need to to assess or to evaluate in that sense, right? So these are some of the typical things that you can be asked to identify with regards to the business cycles. And not to leave this one out, they would ask you to identify weaknesses, also commonly known as red flags, especially on a question that has something to do with fraudulent activity taking place within a particular organization that they would have brought within the system description in the examination. So they would ask you to identify weaknesses, identify red flags, and of course, they would also ask you to identify risks. In fact, let me put this one as a separate thing because it's not the same thing as red flags and weaknesses. So they would also ask you guys to identify, let me just put them as risks here. And then of course, they will also expect you to give recommendation. Now, what I'm pinpointing for you, you would also find these similar things or similar concepts being tested in AUI 3702 when it comes to business cycles. But there is a slight difference when it comes to this aspect. So in AUI 3701, the common ones definitely this one, you would expect a question where they will ask you to identify weaknesses or red flags in the system description. Then also analytical procedures, I can bet you will definitely find them. Audit objectives, same thing, you also find them in a case of an examination or even in the case of an assignment. So you just need to be conscious or be aware about it when you get questions concerning this. Then, of course, the last one is topic 7, which deals with determining the scope and the objectives of the engagement. So when it comes to this part, this is basically that principle that explains about how we as internal auditors are expected to draft audit objectives, and which is this principle number 2. So what is the source of information that we use in order for us to draft an appropriate audit objective relevant and applicable to the audit assignment that we've been given by management or the board? So it's very important to understand the dynamics behind that, but we're going to look into it in detail when we get to that particular topic, right? So these are the typical 7 topics of note in AUI 3701 according to your study material, because I just wanted to make sure that at least you have a broader picture of what we are going to be looking at, based off, of course, on your study material, and then, of course, looking at the notes that I've prepared. So the notes that I've given, which I've also shared with you guys on the group, it pertains to topic number 1, according to your study material, which is the International Professional Practice Framework requirements pertaining to the planning of an internal audit. So what are those things that we are expected to follow or to oblige with as internal auditors when we are, planning an internal audit assignment? Right. So now let's begin to unveil that, the IPPF principle. So now when it comes to the IPPF principle, you need to understand that it's divided into 2 groups, which I'm going to talk about as we progress, right? But then that 2 groups, obviously, it's namely what we call mandatory requirements, and then, of course, you've got what we call strongly recommended requirements, right? And you're going to see it as I go to the other slideshow, but here I was just sort of like giving a breakdown of the elements, but without any category or grouping in any order in this particular slideshow. So obviously, common elements that we're going to be looking at would include the definition of internal auditing, the IA Code of Ethics, the International Standards for the Professional Practice of Internal Auditing, which is obviously what I normally call the IPPF standards in short. Then, of course, core principles for the professional practice of internal auditing. Already by just outlining these first 4 elements, I've already touched on what we call mandatory IPPF requirements. Then from implementation guidance, supplemental guidance, and of course, GTAs and guides to the assessment of IT. This is going together with supplemental guidance, by the way. It's one and the same thing. So these 2, implementation guidance and supplemental guidance, we call those ones, we call them strongly recommended IPPF requirements. So you're going to see that now, just soon after I've explained the difference between mandatory requirements and, of course, recommended requirements. So if we say something is mandatory, right? If something is regarded or considered mandatory, it simply means that we are expected to comply. So if something is regarded mandatory, it means we are expected to comply. If we are looking at it by virtue of law, it means we are obligated to comply with the requirements of the law, right? But in this case, we are looking at principles, all right, that subject us to the practice of internal auditing. So there are certain principles that we are expected to comply. There is no compromise in that regard. It means you need to observe each and every detail that is given there. So that's what mandatory requirements in this case would refer to. And then when it comes to the strongly recommended requirements, the strongly recommended requirements here would refer to certain guidelines that are endorsed by the IIA, which is the Institute of Internal Auditing. So there are certain writing or guidance that the IIA recommends us as internal auditors to use, in the process of performing our responsibilities when it comes to our services as internal auditors. And I'm referring here in this regards to assurance services and the consulting services that we would provide to our clients, right? So that's the two groups of the IPPF requirements. Now let's begin to look at the elements that fits in within the two groups that I've outlined. Now, before we do that, each one of these, the IPPF framework itself in its entirety, it is subject to the mission of internal auditing. It is subject to the mission of internal auditing. And I'll explain what the mission of internal auditing really entails. But essentially, all these requirements within the IPPF, I'm talking of the two groups, they are all subject to the mission of internal auditing. And then, of course, sorry about that. And then, of course, we also have the strongly recommended. So the ones in a dark blue color, right? These are your mandatory guidance or your mandatory IPPF elements. So this would involve the core principles of internal auditing, the definition of internal auditing, the IPPF standards, and the code of ethics. I'm going to try and give special focus, obviously, to the three of the mandatory guidance, which is definition of internal auditing, the standards, and the code of ethics. Then I will deal with the core principles of internal auditing in a separate note altogether for the interest of our time. But the ones you see in a light gray shaded color, those are what we call strongly recommended guidance. And there are two in particular. So we've got what we call implementation guidance, all right? And then the supplemental guidance. Normally with implementation guidance, so that you gain an understanding. You'll notice when we deal with standards, right? I'm talking of the IPPF standards. There's two groups of standards, IPPF standards, namely attribute standards, and then there's performance standards. But for you to gain understanding in a greater detail as to what attribute standards really are, what those principles explained really mean, you need to read what we call implementation standards. So when you go to the implementation standards, it is explained in a greater detail through what we call the implementation guidance. I'm going to show all of that detail when we get there, right? So it's very important to take note of that, right? Then let's come to that. So this is the same classification, but of course in a tabular format. So these are the four mandatory guidance or mandatory elements to the IPPF framework, and then of course the strongly recommended requirements. So I'm not going to do much on that because it's one in the same thing that you saw earlier. Now, what is the mission of internal auditing? Now, when you're talking of a mission in general, a mission is basically what an organization intends to achieve. It is also it can also be attributed to as what is the core purpose of existence for a particular organization. So when you're talking of a mission of internal auditing, we're trying to understand what is it that explains the core purpose of existence of internal audit as a profession. So our purpose or our mission as internal auditors is to enhance and protect organizational value. How? By providing a risk-based and objective assurance, advice, and insight. Notice there are two key words I want you to observe. We enhance, meaning to say we are improving, all right, the condition that is within the organization. Not only improving it, but we also protect assets within the organization. That's organizational value. When you're talking of organizational value, we're talking about the assets that the organization owns, right? So we are supposed to protect the assets of the organization through the services, which comes in two formats. It has to be a risk-based and objective assurance service, advice, and insight. So the advice part of it, it's really the consulting services in nature. So this is our mission as internal auditors. Now let's move forward and begin to explain one of the elements of the IPPF framework. So now, the definition of internal auditing, and just also so you can gain perspective, how do they test this particular aspect in the exam? Most of the times, this comes as a multiple choice question, all right? Comes as a multiple choice question, mostly. You barely see it in an essay-based format per se, but you can find something to do with the definition, internal auditing, in an MCQ question setup. So what is internal auditing really? Internal auditing can be explained as an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity, right? Now, this already, all right, the assurance and consulting activity, it's explaining the nature of services that internal auditors offer or provide to the client. So it can either be assurance in nature, or it can be a consulting activity. So consulting activity, so that you understand what it is, it's basically, agreed upon engagements. Agreed upon engagements. Whereas the assurance activities, really, these are actual internal audit engagements, which can range from compliance audits, IT audits, environmental audits, financial audits, etc., etc. Fraud audits as well, it's part of it, right? So that's what makes up assurance activities. So these are actual internal audit engagements. Whereas with consulting activities, we say these are agreed upon engagements, and this could involve facilitation, consultations on a specific or a particular method, trainings over a particular, maybe it could be a system that the organization want to implement. And then we as internal auditors, we are, hired so that we can be able to train, people in a particular department within the organization or so, right? So those are what we call consulting activities. Now, what is the core purpose of these two activities that we provide in our profession as internal auditors? It's there so that we can add value and improve the organization's operations. It helps an organization accomplish its objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach and to improve the effectiveness of three significant areas, which I want you to take special attention to. The effectiveness of risk management processes, in control processes, as well as governance processes. I want to repeat again. All these services we are providing, whether assurance or consulting, yes, we are providing these services to add value, improve the operations of the organization. But how do we do that? We follow a systematic, disciplined approach where we will be evaluating as well as improving. So now we're explaining now this aspect where we are evaluating and improving the effectiveness of three processes that takes place within the organization. Number one, the risk management processes within the organization. And that's where the concept of enterprise risk management processes becomes handy. Hence, you'll notice there's one of those topics where you'll be dealing with the principles of enterprise risk management. And then, of course, there's a control processes as well. I mean, organizations by nature, they implement certain internal control systems in order for them to achieve their objectives, right? So we also need to evaluate how adequate their internal control system is in regards to achieving of the set objectives there. Then, of course, governance processes here will be, it's really pertaining to how the organization is being directed, how certain structures are set in place within the organization, and looking, of course, at the workload that has to be accomplished to satisfy the objectives of the organization at hand, right? So that's the definition of internal auditing in a nutshell, in a very simplified manner. Now, like I said, this principle is really tested in MCQs, so I don't want to dwell so much on that. But then I want to talk about the part which is tested in exams, and also you would find it in assignments sometimes. So what you'll discover with this one I'm about to talk about, which is the IIA Code of Ethics, you'll find the IIA Code of Ethics in assignments. You also find it even in exams. So sometimes what they do, they can either test it in an assignment, and if they do, chances of them bringing it in the exam, they will be very slim. However, if you don't find it in the assignments at all, then just know for a fact that you'll find it in the exams. And it can come in both ways, MCQ based, or it can also come as an application based type of a question, right? So it's very important to take note of that, right? Very, very important. Are we together?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. Right. Now let's talk about this, the principles of IIA Code of Ethics. Now with the IIA Code of Ethics, you discover that it's comprised of two components, and the two components here, it's namely the principles of the Code of Ethics, and then obviously the rules of conduct. So I just want to draw up something that my lecturer, when I was still doing my undergrad at the University of Pretoria, this is what she explained to us. I'll never forget this. And that's how I was able to master the principles of of the IIA Code of Ethics, right? So here is what she said. And by the way, the person that I'm talking about, she's even the author of your prescribed textbooks, Dr. Plant. So here's what she explained. So she said, if you want to remember the principles of internal auditing, you picture your face as a human being. You've got two eyes, you've got a nose, then obviously you've got a mouth. Now, the two eyes that you see, which almost appears like C's, it's representing, number one, the first eye is representing confidentiality. The second eye representing competency. The nose, which is like an eye over there, it's representing integrity of the internal auditor. Integrity of the internal auditor. And then, of course, the mouth, which almost looks like an O there, it's really representing the principle of objectivity. So all these that you see that I'm outlining from the face of it, the typical face of a human being, these are principles of the IIA Code of Ethics. So there's objectivity as well. Right. So that's how you can easily remember the 4 principles of IIA Code of Ethics. Now, just so that at least I summarize them at a high level before I take you back to the notes, confidentiality, it's the moment you hear the term confidentiality, what should come into your mind? The fact that we are dealing with information. And those rules of conduct explain what you do when information is given or presented to you as an auditor in the course of performing your duties to the employer or to the client. What are you supposed to do with that information? Number one, you're supposed to protect the information that is given to you. That implies that it should never be found falling in the hands of an unauthorized party, right? So what I've just explained to you now, it's one of the typical rules of conduct when it comes to confidentiality. The other one, obviously, is that we should not use that information for our personal gain. That's very important. So one way to remember confidentiality is the fact that you'll be dealing with information. You'll be dealing with information. Now, the second one is competency, right? But I'm going to explain the rules of conduct in details, obviously, when we get to the notes. Now, another way to remember the competency aspect. Competence aspect, it has to do with 3 things about the internal auditor that have to always be continually improved. One of them is your knowledge set as an auditor. Your knowledge set as an auditor. Number 2, your skill set as an auditor. And lastly, your experience as an auditor. We are expected to continually improve our knowledge, our skill, as well as our experience levels as internal auditors. Now, the moment you're talking about integrity, what should come into your mind is has to do with being trustworthy. So I'm gonna point out the trust, honesty. Trust, honesty, and diligence. That's what deals with the principle of integrity. But I'm going to talk about it. I mean, I'm going to show all these things to you when you get, I mean, going back to the notes. But yeah, I'm just trying to help you remember the principles in a much simplified way. Objectivity, you can only be objective if you have an unbiased mental attitude, unbiased mental attitude. So in other words, you do not allow anything to influence your professional judgment in as far as the audit assignment given to you is concerned, right? So these are your typical 4 principles of the IIA Code of Ethics that we're going to be looking at. And obviously I'm going to be explaining the rules of conduct as well, right? So what's going to happen now, obviously, this part A of our lecture 2, I mean lecture 1 rather, it's coming to a closing. We're going to be reconnecting, and then we're proceeding to part B. And in part B, that's where I'll be explaining the principles of the IIA Code of Ethics in detail, and of course together with the accompanying rules of conduct. And then I'll also touch, of course, on the the IPPF standards. But just before I do that, let me just give you just a high-level overview regarding to the next element besides the IIA Code of Ethics that I'll be talking about, which is the IPPF standards. I just want you to take note of this, right? So I'm just going to say the standards. So standards are broken down into 2 groups. So you've got number 1, the attribute standards. Attribute standards, and then the second one is called performance standards. Performance standards. Now with the attribute standards, what you just need to remember, of course, I'm going to explain that in detail. This one, it has to do with the person of who an internal auditor is, and then of course the nature of work, or let me just say the work that we as internal auditors will perform. Then here, performance standards, they really deal with the audit process and then other aspects. I'll just put down the audit process, because you'll discover that they'll be explaining what happens during the engagement process, the engagement planning process, during the performing of the audit assignment, what you do when you're now reporting, and all what are those principles that govern those functionalities, right? So in part B, we will be looking at those in detail, in a greater detail. Right. Thank you. So let's wait for part B.